Good morning, students. Today, let us learn about the cerebrospinal fluid. So, what is cerebrospinal fluid? So, we have seen in the last few classes about the spinal cord and the brain, and we should understand the protective effect of cerebrospinal fluid for the brain and the spinal cord. So, we know there are three protective layers. That is the meninges, the outer vertebral column for the spinal cord, and the skull for the brain, and the third protective layer is the cerebrospinal fluid. So, what is cerebrospinal fluid? It is a clear, colorless liquid that protects the brain as well as the spinal cord from injuries. It can be either a chemical injury or a physical injury. It can be anything. So, it is a very, very important liquid or a layer which is, prevents the shock, or it acts as an insulator or shock absorber. That is what you can call about the cerebrospinal fluid. So what does it do? It carries oxygen, glucose, and other chemicals needed for the brain and the spinal cord from the blood to the neurons and neuroglia. So this is the important, that is the transport of oxygen, glucose, and other needed chemicals. It also prevents the entry of other toxic chemicals also. So what does it do? It continuously circulates through the cavities in the brain and spinal cord, and around the brain and the spinal cord, where in the subarachnoid space. So it is circulating in the subarachnoid space, which is the space between the arachnoid matter and the pia matter. That is the middle layer, and the inner layer. So this is very, very important. There are four CSF filled cavities within the brain called as the ventricles. So ventricles are little cavities which are filled with the cerebrospinal fluid within the brain. So what are the four ventricles in the brain? So first one is the lateral ventricle. So lateral ventricle is located on each hemisphere of the cerebrum. So we can see the picture later in the later slides. So lateral ventricle is the first one. Cerebrospinal will be produced by the lateral ventricles, followed by the lateral ventricles. Anteriorly, the lateral ventricles are separated by a thin membrane called the septum pellucidum. So this is the next one, second one, that is the septum pellucidum, which is a transparent one. The third ventricle is a narrow cavity along the midline superior to the upper to the hypothalamus, and between the right and the left halves of the thalamus. So this is the third one. So fourth ventricle lies between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So the first ventricle, that is called as the lateral ventricle, is present in the each hemisphere of the cerebrum. The fluid is flowing through the septum pellucidum and the intervertebral foramen, and the third ventricle, which is present in between the hypothalamus, that is the superior to the hypothalamus, and between the two halves of the thalamus. Fourth ventricle lies between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this is the position, and the total volume of the cerebrospinal fluid is 80 to 150 ml in an adult. What does it contain? So it contains glucose, proteins, lactic acids, urea, and some ions like the cations like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and anions like chloride and bicarbonates. It also contains some blood vessels, that is the white blood cells. Not blood vessels, I'm sorry, it is white blood cells. So, what are the functions? What are the functions of the cerebrospinal fluid? The cerebrospinal fluid contributes to homeostasis in three main ways. So, it provides mechanical protection, chemical protection, as well as helps in the circulation and transport. So, what is mechanical protection? As I told you, CSF acts as a shock absorbing medium that protects the delicate inner layers of the brain and the spinal cord. You see, the brain is a very delicate, soft tissue. Spinal cord is also very soft. So, it has to be protected, and it has to be preserved inside a heavy the bony structures of the vertebra and the cranium. So it is very, very important. Inside the cranium and the vertebral column, it contains this fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, which acts as a shock absorber, insulator, which protects the brain and the spinal cord from any injury or any shock or shake or anything. It acts like a buoyancy. The brain floats in the cerebrospinal fluid. Second one is chemical protection. So this provides an environment, a very optimal chemical environment for the neuronal signaling. So this is very very important. The ionic composition is very optimum. Even if there is a slight change in the ionic composition of the cations or the anions, it will seriously lead to some complications within the brain. It will disrupt the production or propagation of the action potentials and the postsynaptic potentials. So it is very, very important for propagation. The third one is circulation. As I told you, CSF allows the exchange of nutrients and waste products between the blood and the nervous tissue. So transport of nutrients and removal of the waste products. So where is the cerebrospinal fluid formed? So formation of the cerebrospinal fluid takes place in the ventricles. We have seen there are four ventricles. So the site of cerebrospinal fluid production is called as the choroid plexus. So choroid plexus are a network of blood capillaries. You can see in the pictures later. It is a network of microscopic blood capillaries or blood vessels in the walls of the ventricles. So the walls of the ventricles contain this choroid plexus, which are a network of blood capillaries. So apart from the choroid plexus, the capillaries are covered by some special kind of cells called as the ependymal cells. So these are the cells that form the cerebrospinal fluid, from where it is forming from the blood plasma by filtration and secretion. So the blood which is secreted into the ventricles, they are converted into cerebrospinal fluid by the ependymal cells. So the ependymal cells forms the cerebrospinal fluid from the blood plasma by filtration and some kind of secretion. So the ependymal cells are does not allow certain materials to pass through or get transported. So they're joined together by tight junctions. So they are very very important. So materials entering CSF from choroid plexus or choroid capillaries cannot leak between these cells. So instead, they must pass through the ependymal cells. So they have to pass through the ependymal cells, which are guarded by tight junctions. So the transport is very much, very specific. So the blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier only permits certain substances to enter the CSF, not all the substances. That is why selective permeation. Selective permeation, that is a blood brain barrier, gives, or blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier gives a selective permeation to certain chemicals, thereby protecting the brain and spinal cord from entry of other harmful chemical substances or toxins. So in this picture, you can see the location of the ventricles within a transparent brain. So one interventricular foramen on each side connects a lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. So here you can see these are the first one, lateral ventricles. So there are two. This is one side of the cerebrum. You know that the cerebrum is lateral ventricles are present in the cerebrum. So these are the lateral ventricles. There is a foramen called as interventricular foramen. So this foramen, as you know, the opening connects the lateral ventricles with the third ventricle. You can see this is the third ventricle. Third ventricle is present in the between the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So this is the third ventricle. See the cerebrospinal fluid, which is formed in the lateral ventricles by the filtration of the blood and the secretions of the choroid plexus, will be transported through the interventricular foramen to the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it is passing on to the fourth ventricle to through another, you can say, septum, or you can say an opening called as the aqueduct of the midbrain. So it is called as the cerebral aqueduct. It is present in the midbrain. Then it is passed on to the, to the next fourth ventricle. So this you can see is the fourth ventricle. So from the fourth ventricle, it passes into the spinal cord. So here there are two apertures called that is you can see three apertures, one median aperture and a pair of lateral apertures are present. So these are the openings. So what are the openings? There are three openings. So you can see here interventricular foramen and the cerebral aqueduct. Interventricular foramen allows the transport of the CSF from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. The aqueduct of the midbrain allows the passage of the CSF from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. See here, the lateral aperture and the median aperture. Lateral apertures are in pair. The median aperture is single. They allow the passage of the CSF into the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord, this is the medulla oblongata, this is the pons. So this we have seen in the previous structure. The brain is made up of cerebrum, cerebellum, pons, medulla oblongata, midbrain. So this forms the stem, brain stem. Brain stem is formed with the medulla oblongata. Above the medulla oblongata you have the pons, and above the pons you have the midbrain. So these are the locations of the ventricles and the different openings of the ventricle. So let us see the circulation of CSF. So how and where the CSF is formed? CSF is formed by the ependymal cells of the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is a network of blood capillaries, micro blood capillaries, which is capable of forming the CSF by the filtration of the blood passing through it, and also by some secretions. So these cerebrospinal fluid is formed in different ventricles, all the ventricles. It is formed in the lateral ventricle, it is formed in the third ventricle, it is also formed in the fourth ventricle. So at each and every stage, the CSF is contributed by different areas of the ventricle or different regions of the ventricles. So when it is formed in the choroid plexus of lateral ventricles, one on each side of the cerebrum, it flows into the third ventricle through, I told you, an opening, okay, narrow oval opening called the interventricular foramina or interventricular foramen. So again, when it goes reaches the third ventricle, more CSF is produced by the third ventricle by the choroid plexus present in the third ventricle. The choroid plexus is present in the roof of the third ventricle. So they also supply or produce or secrete more and more CSF. So this fluid will pass or flow through the aqueduct of the midbrain, that is the cerebral aqueduct, through the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. From the third ventricle, the CSF is passed through to the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of the midbrain. Next, the choroid plexus is again formed by the fourth ventricle. Some more contribution of the CSF is done by the fourth ventricle. Now the CSF enters the subarachnoid space through three openings in the roof of the fourth ventricle. So there is a single median aperture and a paired lateral apertures, one on each side. So these will allow the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid from the fourth ventricle into the subarachnoid space. Then what happens? The CSF then circulates into the central canal of the spinal cord, and in the subarachnoid space around the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. It moves, circulates to the blood through the spinal cord, and then it flows. It is collected by the heart and the lungs, and again they flow. That is the blood will again flow into the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle, which again forms more and more cerebrospinal fluid. So the CSF is gradually reabsorbed. As I told you, it is reabsorbed into the blood. So there are some villi called as the arachnoid villi. So the arachnoid villi are finger-like extensions of the arachnoid layer that will project into the dural venous sinuses. So venous sinuses will collect the CSF through the finger-like projections called the arachnoid villi. So what is arachnoid villi? They are finger-like projections or extension of the arachnoid that project or protrude into the dural venous sinuses. So called, especially called as the superior sagittal sinus. So superior sagittal sinus collects the CSF from the arachnoid villi, and that is this arachnoid villi, when it is in the form of a cluster, it is called as the arachnoid granulation. Normally CSF is reabsorbed as rapidly as it is formed by the choroid plexus at a rate of about 20 ml per hour, that is 480 ml per day. So the rate of formation of the CSF and the rate of absorption are the same. So the pressure of the CSF is continuously maintained, and it is constant. There is no change in the pressure of the CSF. So this you can see, this is the ventricle. So this you can see the pathways of the circulating cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is formed from the blood plasma and some of the secretions of the ventricles. So you can see these are the ventricles, and this is the ependymal cells which form the CSF, and in between the ependymal cells you can see they are guarded by tight junctions. So this is the CSF, and this is the blood capillary choroid plexus. See here you can see the different falx cerebri which separates the cerebrum, and falx cerebelli which separates the cerebellum. I think there is a spelling mistake here. So this is the superior sagittal sinus. So the CSF flows from the lateral ventricle. See, there are two lateral ventricles, one on each side of the cerebrum. It passes through the interventricular foramen, that is the septum pellucidum. This is the septum, just like a nasal septum. This is also a septum, and these are choroid plexus present in the third ventricles. Then they pass on to the fourth ventricle and then into the spinal cord through the superior sagittal sinus. They drain later into the superior sagittal sinus, that is the veins which take the blood, carry the blood to the heart and the lungs, and again they are recirculated back into the brain. This is how the cerebrospinal fluid is circulated. So here this is the sagittal section of the brain and the spinal cord. You can see this is the sagittal section, as you can see, and you can see the different the choroid plexus is shown here. The network of blood capillaries, you can see these are the red colored ones here, here, and here. These are the choroid plexus. So this is the arachnoid villus. So as we have seen, this is the arachnoid villus through which the CSF is drained. Okay, finger like projections. So these are the subarachnoid space, and you can see this is the lateral ventricles. First one, a pair of lateral ventricles, and the CSF flows from the lateral ventricle into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen, and this is the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle, and you can see the this is the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles. So this is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, and here you can see this is the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. So this is the CSF flows from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle through a septum called as through a duct called as the aqueduct of the midbrain. So these are some of the sinuses. This is a straight sinus, and you can see the subarachnoid sinus. This is the subarachnoid space, and this is the lateral aperture. One a pair of lateral aperture and another aperture, median aperture is there. Median, this is the median aperture. This is the median aperture, and a pair of lateral aperture through which the CSF flows from the fourth ventricle into the spinal cord. So this is how it flows. This is the violet colored ones are the path of CSF, and the blue colored ones are the path of the venous blood. See, it is finally drained through the arachnoid villus into the subarachnoid space. So you can see the subarachnoid space, and then it flows out. It comes here. See, again it comes from the blood. It again comes into the lateral ventricles, so that choroid plexus can filter it and secrete and produce the CSF. So that is how it is done. Here you can see very clearly showing the frontal view. The previous picture we have seen the sagittal view. Here this is the frontal view, where you can see the lateral ventricle, a pair of lateral ventricles, and these are the choroid plexus, the red colored blood vessels, and this is the septum pellucidum through which the CSF flows into the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle, and from the third ventricle it flows through the aqueduct of the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle, and here there are two apertures, a pair of lateral apertures, and this is a median aperture through which the blood flows into the spinal cord. And these are finally the CSF will drain into the subarachnoid space surrounding the spinal cord and the brain into the arachnoid villus, and then joins the blood vessels. So this is how the CSF gets circulated. And this is a summary of the formation, circulation, and absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. See here, the blood from the heart and the lungs is carried through the arterial blood. It flows into the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. So the choroid plexus present in lateral, third, and fourth ventricle, they are capable of producing the CSF. So with the help of these cells, ependymal cells, and the choroid plexus, what happens? They will filter the blood vessel and also secrete some fluid to form the final CSF. So this will flow from the lateral ventricle choroid plexus into the lateral ventricles. So again, from the lateral ventricles, it flows into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramina, and then you can see it through the septum pellucidum. Again, the third ventricle also supplies some more additional CSF. This will again flow into the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of the midbrain called as the cerebral aqueduct. Again, in the fourth ventricle, some more fluid is secreted and transported. From the fourth ventricle, it passes through the lateral and the median apertures into the subarachnoid space. So, from the subarachnoid space, the arachnoid villi takes the cerebrospinal fluid. The arachnoid villi present in the dural venous sinuses. So it flows into the venous. See, the color of the arrow is changed here. So now this is the venous blood. The venous blood takes the CSF to the heart and the lungs for purification. So this is a summary of the formation, circulation, and the absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. Thank you for listening. And in the next class, we will study about the brainstem.